Hi guys, it's Tom Cunith. I'm a solutions architect with Cisco's Advanced Services. In this video, we're going to talk about configuration templates. This is one of the functions of Cisco SD-WAN that really helps us with operational simplicity and efficiency of the solution. So, with me today, I have Zane, who's a technical marketing engineer.
Hi Tom, how you doing?
Good, Zane, how are you? Have you messed around with any configuration templates yet?
Absolutely, it's exciting.
Yeah, it is. And I also have Krell, who's also a technical marketing engineer. How are you doing today, Krell?
Hey Tom, good, thanks. Glad to be here.
Excellent.
Excited to learn config templates.
Leading the discussion today will be David Klebanoff. David, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you very much, Tom. So, hey guys, today we're going to talk about the configuration templates, the device configuration templates, the way they're used in our Cisco SD-WAN solution. So, first, it's important to define what are device configuration templates, right? So there's a couple of uses for device configuration templates within our solution. So first and foremost, of course, just as the name suggests, it's the ability to define all of the configuration parameters for the devices that participate in the SD-WAN fabric. Now we're going to talk about different types of configuration templates. Some of those apply to the routers, some of those apply to the controllers, some of those apply to the management system itself. Right, so we're going to talk about different types of those templates, but fundamentally it's to define those configuration parameters for those elements. Now the second element is to enforce that configuration, because when you define the configuration, you want to make sure that that configuration is always enforced for templates for those devices, and you want to make sure that the system enforces that, so there's no deviation from what you have defined as the settings that you want. Right now, templates, the way that we have them, are extremely customizable. That doesn't mean that you have to go and customize every single element of a template. Everything that we have in a configuration templates has a default value. So you only modify things that you really need to modify. And we really have customers who have deployed configuration templates in a very vanilla, sort of speak, form, where they primarily rely on just the default settings and customize just a few things that are important for their specific deployment. And we also have customers who have really gone the other way, have customized every single thing or many of the things that are possible to configure and change and tweak within the configuration templates. So you have a full flexibility from the operation standpoint to either rely primarily on mostly defaults or rely on some of the tweaks that are required for your specific environment. So that flexibility and a degree of customization is extremely important for smaller environments, but more importantly for the larger environments where you have really diversity of different configuration patterns and things like that. Right? Now, as we touched on some of the larger environments, we also have the ability to deploy those device configuration templates in bulk. So when you're talking about provisioning one device, two devices, configuration templates may not seem like something critical. Right? You can always do them sort of, if I didn't have configuration templates, I could always do them manually and just go device by device, because all I'm doing is just deploying a couple of devices. Right? So it may not sound so meaningful, but when you're talking about bulk deployments, when we have customers who have been deploying dozens of sites per night, right? There's really massive deployments like that. It's really critical to be able to roll out those configuration templates in this bulk fashion. Right?
Also, I guess they'd be useful, very useful and efficient for rolling out changes. So you've already gotten your configurations in. You need to make a SNMP trap agent change. A one push to a template, it gets everywhere. Right?
Absolutely, yes. So once the configuration, that's a very good point, Tom. It actually goes back into what we talked about as enforcing the configuration consistency. So once you have the configuration consistency, once you have those configuration templates applied or attached to dozens of devices, hundreds of devices, sometimes thousands of devices, obviously you want to make sure that your changes are easily propagated across all of those devices. So it's a very good point, is that this bulk provisioning is not necessarily the very first provisioning that you're doing, but it's also the operational efficiencies that come with the fact that you are deploying this in production and you want to make those changes as you sort of continue using the system.
So David, just a quick question. So the idea is to keep it the least amount device specific. The only device specific criteria or components you want is you want to keep that to a minimum. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct, Zain. So we're going to touch on that in a subsequent slides when we talk about how do you differentiate between sort of a global configurations which apply to all the devices and some of the specific configuration elements that apply to potentially just the individual devices, right? So like I mentioned, there's lots of flexibility, right? This is very important. This item cannot emphasize this more. The flexibility and the ability to customize things is extremely important. Again, not for everybody, but for some, it's a really critical element of that. But it's exactly to your point is that sometimes you have to really get really specific to supplying individual configuration parameters on a per device basis. And we have the facilities to do that through the use of something we call variables, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later. But yes, that's absolutely very, very key point is you want to make sure that you are defining this holistically for the entire network, yet have the ability to go and drill down to the individual device level and being able to enforce that configuration consistency on a per device basis as well. So it's very important. And another very important operational element, just like you, Tom, mentioned in the very beginning, is the provisioning piece of it. So if I were to mark things with the importance, this is another important item, which is the centrally provisioned configuration templates from the vManage graphical user interface. So we always treat the vManage graphical user interface as a single pane of glass for any operational tasks that are performed against the Cisco SD-WAN fabric. So as you are using vManage tool for the single pane of glass, obviously you want to make sure that the configuration tasks are also done from the same user interface, and that's exactly what we're doing. Everything is rolled out from the configuration section of the vManage graphical user interface. And here, actually, you can see a little bit of a screenshot from the vManage graphical user interface. We're going to show that in a subsequent slides, a little bit more, kind of give you a short demo of how it looks inside the tool itself. But just so you can see, everything is configurable from the graphical user interface, where you navigate into the vManage itself, and then you would basically navigate into the configuration section, and then you would navigate into the template section, and that's where you would start doing all of the provisioning tasks around the defining configuration templates and then applying configuration templates onto the devices. Sure. All right. So now that we understood what the configuration templates are, we want to see the composition of the configuration template. What does it really take to make a configuration template, right? So we already mentioned that vManage is really that central pane of glass, the single pane of glass for all of those administrative tasks that we're performing against the fabric, right? So that's where things get defined. Now, what are we really defining when we define those configuration templates? Is we define individual features, right? So what you see in here, it's a representation of individual features, right? So these are the things that have to do with system level parameters. These are things that have to do with security. This is the transport VPN connectivity, which is VPN 0 in our case. This is a service VPN configurations. There's things that have to do with routing, and there's more. There's things that have to do with AAA authentication. There's things that have to do with NTP and keeping time synchronized, syslogging, SNMP, things like that. So features that go and comprise the entire device configuration, right? So those are the individual features. Now, inside those individual features, think about those as buckets. Inside each one of them, we have the individual settings. And when we say something is a system, it's actually a collection of individual settings that go inside the system. Same thing happens for security, transport, service. Some of those have a lot of settings. Some of them have a little settings. It depends on how the block is.
So one quick clarification is that if you think of the entire device, think of that as kind of an onion. You peel the onion. Now you have a system, security, transport. Is that a good analogy?
It is. It's a good analogy. You can think about this as an onion, right? When you have this holistic template, then you have the individual features, and then inside the individual feature, you have the individual setting. So you can drill down to every single configurable item in the device configuration, and you can change it if you wanted to, or you can leave it as default. Right? So that's exactly what you're representing. It's a very good point. Now, if we see what happens then, is that each one of those individual settings within these feature blocks is actually what determines the final configuration of the device itself, right? And what we can see is that there are 3 different settings that we can apply, or 3 different types of configs that we can apply to each individual setting within this feature, right? So the first one, and the most obvious one, is the default setting. So as I mentioned earlier, we have defaults for everything. So if you define a configuration template, and you sort of have to define configuration template because you want the advantages that we talked about from the operation standpoint, when you want holistic enforcement of the configuration, make sure that it's all compliant. So you want to develop configuration templates. If you are encountering a setting that you are unsure about, or if this is a setting that you don't want to change, just leave it. Everything has a default. You don't have to touch things that you don't want to change, right? So this is the default setting, and everything has it. It's very similar to what you would encounter with existing Cisco devices, which are non-SD-WAN devices. If you look at the device configuration, there's a set of defaults that you never had to configure, and the system comes with those default configs. This is it. It's just translated into the SD-WAN world. So this is the default setting for that feature. Now the next one you want to look at is a global setting. So what is a global setting? So if you recall, when we talked about configuration templates being applied to different devices, there could be certain settings that are common across all of the devices, right? Obviously, the defaults are common because these are defaults, but there could be things that you want to modify yet keep them the same.
So like an SNMP community stack
Exactly.
or something like that, right?
Another example I thought would be maybe if you want gig 0/1 to always be part of your transport.
That is true. Yes, that is true. So things like permanent configuration changes that you've done, and they are exactly the same across all of the devices you're deploying. And this could be interface assignments, AAA servers, SNMP, trap destinations, NTP servers, anything that you want to define and change the defaults, define, but yet you're not interested in making a per device customizations. You're really interested in just setting the value for all of the devices and having the system enforce that, and everybody's compliant with this config, but it's the same config. Right. And then you go into the third one, which is really that device specific, which gives you a lot of flexibility. So what is a device specific? It is deviation from the default setting. So you are changing something, yet what you're interested in is you're not interested in setting one global value for every single device that this is attached to. You're interested in setting in per device values. Where would that be interesting? For example, interface descriptions. Maybe the interface ID is going to be the same, yet the interface description could be different on a per device basis or in per group device basis, right? So I can go and I can mark something as variable, and what really variable means is that that star we have in here that basically says this value is going to be provided later, because when I'm taking this template that I've created and I'm attaching this to the devices, this is where I'm going to be asked to provide the values for those things that I've marked as device specific, because the system does need to know.
Quick question. Are these templates are predefined and available, or the customer needs to create some of these templates, or both?
It's a very good question. So as we said, there's a default setting. So the default setting does not refer to just the specific configurations, but it actually refers to everything. So if you were to start completely from scratch and you have absolutely nothing configured, nothing customized, the system already comes with a set of those individual features that are defined within the system. All you'll have to do is create a new template and then just pull those individual features together into this configuration template, but they are defined. Now, there are certain things that you will be forced to provide a value for. So there are some specific system settings that have to be provided in order for this template to be viable. So we're going to touch on those things, but there's a couple of things that you have to specify: host name, system IP, site ID, some really specific things that you have to provide, and these are system level parameters. You have to define those. But you don't have to go and modify things that you don't want to modify. Everything has a default on the feature level and on the individual setting level. It's a good question. So back to the device specifics is that we gave interface description as an example, right? So interface description is something that could become a variable.
Well, IP addressing obviously is the most common, right?
Exactly, right? So basically anything can be turned into the variable. Now, how many variables do you have? It's really an administrative preference. If you want to create a common configuration across many devices, and that's how your network is structured, is that everything is exact replica, then you may end up with a very few configuration templates. Well, maybe as little as one, right? That's unrealistic. What is more realistic is you have a certain deviation. The question is how many of those deviations you have. If you have a lot of deviations, you may end up with a lot of device-specific settings. If you have a few deviations, you will end up with few device-specific settings, sometimes zero. Really depends on how you decided to structure your configuration. But it's important that this gives you that flexibility to supply those values at the time the template is attached. Now, we even make it even simpler, is at the time that you're attaching this, the system is going to prompt you to provide those variables, and those variables can be provided in bulk. So we allow you to import a CSV file into here. And this CSV file, at the time of attachment, is basically going to marry the configuration, variables, and the values for those variables. And that's the resultant config that is actually going to be pushed to the device.
So you can work out all your IP addressing ahead of time. You can basically pre-stage your configurations before you are at the time of the router shows up and you attach to it, and you don't have to do it at real time. You can do it ahead of time.
Absolutely. I think the key word in here is planning.
Yeah.
So planning is extremely important. You have to plan it out. The more time you spend on planning, the better off you are, and you don't have to correct yourself as you go, especially if you're deploying a more complicated environment or a large environment. So planning is extremely important, specifically for laying down these configuration templates. It actually applies to many things, but specifically for configuration templates is extremely important because it's such a critical element that really defines the configuration of all the devices.
So when we talk about device-specific, that portion of it, if I by default configure everything global, but I have some device-specific parameters, all that will be exported into a CSV, for example, and those variables will then be inputted by an administrator, by someone, and then we will import that back. So all the config will be in vMan. Is that?
Absolutely, yes. So you hint in a different sort of an interesting operational aspect of that. So I kind of glanced over that when I said the CSV is only working in one direction as an import into the system. But you're absolutely right. When you are going through this planning phase and when you have identified what are the device-specific parameters that you want to designate, there is a first step that you would do is you can actually export this file out. Then follow what Tom has mentioned, is that do the planning, provide the values in here, and then build the CSV file and upload it back. So step 1 would be planning, that's for sure. Step 2 could be the export. Step 3 would be filling out the CSV file, and step 4 would be the import. And then obviously you have the step 5, which is apply this onto the device itself. And that is at the time of the attachment. So you really go through these steps to make sure that your configuration is well done. So we talked about device configuration templates. One thing to understand in here is we actually have 2 ways of executing that. So what we really focused on before is this side, which we call a feature template. So this should look familiar to you, right? These are exactly the features that we had before, the system, the transport, routing, security, and they're all put together into the feature template, sort of like an onion, right? Side by side, we have a certain administrators that would prefer this view of that. Anybody who has been around networking would recognize this. This is just a simple command line interface. So there's a certain segment of administrators that are comfortable with operating the configuration in the command line interface model. How are these different? Well, obviously, this is a GUI driven. This is inside the GUI. So even though it says CLI template, it is actually executed inside the vManage GUI. So you're not going into the device. This is still a config that is defined in the graphical user interface of the vManage, yet it looks like the CLI format. So both of these are in the vManage, but obviously they look different. This is a completely click-through type of driven. This is type down CLI config, running config. Identical capabilities. Anything I can do here, I can do here. And the vice versa. Which means even the things that we talked about as variables that could exist in here for a specific setting, I can actually designate variables in here as well. And I can say that this DNS is actually a variable.
Yeah, and David, to your point, when I was first learning the solution, what I would do is I would, go into my lab, configure things from the CLI until I had a working configuration. I called that my golden configuration. I would then do a show run, capture that CLI output, and then start to do exactly what you're annotating there. Start to create variables that would be device specific.
Absolutely,
And
yes.
that helped me wrap my head around the whole idea. But I think since I've been working with it for a few more months, I do appreciate the GUI-driven feature templates because there's Rails.
Absolutely, yes. This gives you a little bit sort of, guides you through the process of creating those templates, right? So you know sort of how to operate. This is just a very raw format that you have to be comfortable. One way of doing that is exactly as you say. Go into the device, configure the device. Once you're happy with the config, once you have this golden config, take it, copy, paste it into the CLI template within the vManage GUI, enforce it, and in that moment, it's enforced. So all the things we talked about enforcing and making sure that everybody's compliant with the config equally applies even when config looks like this. We're still doing the config enforcement even if it looks completely CLI format. So it really comes down to the operational practices and comes down to individual preferences of an administrator.
I also think you have to consider your operations people, right? If you're an engineer and architect and you've been doing years of CLI configurations, you may be comfortable for the day zero provisioning, but at some point you're going to hand that over to operations. And if they're only comfortable with the GUI, then they need to know how to navigate through because they're going to be the ones making changes, possibly turning interfaces up and down, and it may be easier to do that in the GUI.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Very, very good point. One thing we didn't mention before is that all of that is also accessible through APIs. So if you are a type of customer that like this DevOps approach, programmability approach, then you can execute those things through the API calls into the vManage, so REST API calls. You can actually execute these configs and make them programmatic like that, right? So it's really a diverse set of capabilities that you can have in order to have these device configurations. Now I wanted to deviate for a second from the slides and just show you guys quickly where things are in the actual graphical user interface of the vManage. So you probably recall this portion of the slide in here is that we had this in the very first slide, which we talked about, is that this is a live vManage system. And what you see in here, this is we have accessed the dashboard and we have navigated to configuration and we've navigated to templates. And what really opens up in templates is this menu where it allows us to create the two types of templates we talked about, be that a CLI template or a feature template, right? So really, step 1, access. Step 2, select configuration. Step 3, navigate to templates. Step 4, start the process of creating the templates. Now, if I were to click into them, then the first one, if I were to click into the CLI template, it's just a CLI template, right? Exactly as you would expect. There are different models that you can have for devices. We're going to touch on that in a short while. But at the end of the day, this is just a CLI config. This is exactly what we talked about before. If you're ready for this, if you want to do it this way, that's your preference, that's how your operations work, great. We have this inside the GUI that you can operate the CLI way, your device configuration. Now, if you want this to be done in a different way, then you would go here and you would say feature templates. Now, it will start populating if I start creating something. So if I were to create a type of a device, you see immediately, to your earlier question, the defaults. Everything immediately inherits the defaults, right? So there's defaults for everything. If I want to go and modify things, then I would navigate into this feature menu. These are customized features, those boxes that we had on the slide. These are the things that have to do with customization of system parameters, VPNs, security, routing, whatnot. So this is my customized features that I can assemble into the feature template when I create one, if that's how I want to operate it. And we really try to encourage people to gravitate towards operating environments in this way rather than this way. So we really want to make sure that people harness the value of the feature templates rather than just being CLI, right?